Simon Smiley-Andrews, a brief introduction to accessibility for the mobile platform.
Cool, well, welcome to a brief introduction to accessibility on the mobile platform. I am indeed Simon Smiley-Andrews. Today we're going to be looking at some of the core concepts in developing for accessible apps and the key factors we need to be aware of to make them usable for everyone. And I'm really pleased that I'm the third in this tech stream because the two talks before this, if you saw them, really start keying off a lot of the key concepts, but on the web side of things. So before we start, can we just get a hands up, anyone who has actually tried using their phones in accessibility mode? Everyone, hooray! If you haven't, I obviously recommend trying it because it really is very different. Over the last couple of months, I've been really struggling with web accessibility. Now, one of the things I find most interesting about mobile accessibility is that there aren't really very many resources giving you best practices on how to do it. With the WCAG principles and a lot of accessibility pointing towards web, the mobile community has really had to create their own best practices based on their experience, with the aim of achieving consistency across their platform and also Android, iOS platforms and all the different other platforms around that. And this is actually more difficult than it sounds. Apple releases a lot of documentation on how to program and how to design, but really when you come to accessibility, they just open the floor up beneath you. And a great example of this is the recent release of iOS 13. So before iOS 13, when you load up a mobile page, the focus goes straight to the back button. On iOS 13, without a single mention, it goes to the first element in the cell. So if you're trying to get consistency, suddenly, what do we do now? Do we change everything before and force it to do what iOS 13 does, or do we change iOS 13 to what the others did? And really, when thinking about accessibility on mobile, we've got all the same things that we're thinking about on web. Every website might have a mobile aspect to it, and so we really need to be aware of that. But today, I'm going to be focusing on what I believe are the three main tenets of mobile accessibility. Now, there are tons more, but if you can get these three right, then most of the other things you can tweak a little bit and get round. If you don't think about these from the start, then you're going to be in trouble. So the first is focus, and this is the screen reader functionality that focuses on specific elements on your screen, just like on web. And we're going to be looking at when to take focus to an element, and also when not to take focus to an element. And also looking at the finer levels of control that are required on mobile, partly due to the screen, partly just due to the complexity of the system that you're working with. The second thing I'm going to be looking at is accessibility labels. And this is the label that's read out when the focus is taken to something. In this section, we're going to be discussing the context around the accessibility label and the different traits that we can assign them, following on a little bit from what Rick was talking about. We're going to be looking at a lot of examples in this section. In the final section, we're going to be looking at the dynamic text. And on mobile, you can set your user preference for how large your text is. In this section, we're going to be looking at how dynamic fonts changes the way that we design and also the way that we code. And we're going to be discussing how important large text in designs actually are. So let's kickstart with focus. And I wrote this talk assuming that I had to come in at quite a low level of understanding, but I'm sure this is just going to be preaching to the choir. So hopefully the video behind me is showing mobile focus in action. When the user swipes right, it moves the focus to the next element. When the user swipes left, it takes the focus to the previous element. You can also drag your finger around the screen to manually go to a specific focus, and then when you double tap, it selects that element. Now, there's loads and loads more. Four-finger tap at the bottom takes you to the last element, and there's some really, really cool ones. Double tap and hold that allows you to manually set the accessibility label for the element if you do want to do it. But for now, we're not going to worry too much about them. Now, when thinking about focus on a mobile device, we really need to think about the context and how we can componentize that focus. We've got two examples here. The one on the left The context here is a help screen from the nav app. And so we want the user to get all the information all at once. On the screen on the right, we can see that when we swipe through, the focus is going to be taken from each element through and through and through until they finally get to the end. They're then going to have to work out what was the piece of information they need. In the right example, it might be that this overall element is a button, it's a cell. But if we tap on the days left label, will something happen? I don't know. Should it be that the days left label is also a button and that we can tap on anything? Again, this causes users a lot of problems. With mobile, we need to start thinking about the context and pulling everything that we want to say with the screen reader into the same area of context. But we're going to see that this isn't quite as easy as it seems. Here's another example. We have all the information, and we've pulled all of them together, I think by mistake in this developer's thing, because this app is not very accessible, into the same focus. But we've left out the image on the left. Now, the image isn't going to be read out. Generally, in mobile, we don't always read out images. Often, if the image is just not important, we just won't mention anything about an image. But in this case, the image is really important about the context of the question. The images show the different topics of the different questions. So really, if it was me, I would pull the focus to cover the entire cell, because otherwise it might add a little bit of confusion to the user. Now, we've mentioned already that Apple doesn't make it easy for us. Here is a screenshot from the App Store. And you can see that when the user swipes down, each individual label will take focus. And this is similar in a lot of ways to how websites often do it. Now, I would argue that the user wants context, and we know exactly the context the user wants. They want context on this specific cell. So if first we took the focus around the entire cell and read out the information that was valid to them in it, experience it now, experience the fall of the Berlin Wall, an interactive history lesson with MAU AR, button, maybe a hint, click to download, that would provide the user exactly what they primarily might want to know. Swiping, again, takes them down into more context of the cell. So that would take them to the AR button in the top left. Swiping again would take them to the volume button, because presumably, again, this is the least thing that they might want to do on this screen. When thinking through this context, immediately you might think, well, let's just put cells all the way through. Let's just go from cell to cell to cell. But actually, we need to be just as aware of what we don't take into focus as what we do take into focus. So again, here's two examples of where we don't really want to take focus to things. On the left, we've got the Settings app, and as we swipe down, the section header will automatically take focus, and it will read out notification style. As we go down through, we then highlight the entire cell, and that information is read out. I would argue, though, that we don't really want to take the focus to the section header. In an iPhone, if you're taking the focus to an element and it doesn't really have anything that the user can do, why are we sending the focus there? We want to encourage the user to be able to explore and do things on the apps, rather than having to hold information about what they're doing. So on the left, I would encourage the notification style context to be included in each cell. Now, when the user swipes down, it will say AFL Live, set notification style, current notification style, off. This view, if you have a lot of apps, could be very long. So maybe the section header disappears off the top. It might be that a user has cognitive disabilities and they can't remember and hold, what section am I in? Including that information in the cell doesn't add a lot of time for it being read out, but it does add a lot of context to help the user understand what they're doing. The example on the right is a disabled button. Now, generally in iOS, we have a lot of buttons that sometimes might be disabled, sometimes might not be. In this scenario, the button will say, cancel button, dimmed. The user, what does that really mean? What do I do with that? If I click cancel, what does it do? In this case, clicking cancel pulls the focus back into the search bar. But That's nothing to do with what the button actually does. I would argue, and in this talk I do argue, that design should be thought of to make it so we don't necessarily need to have buttons that have to be disabled. For example, having a save button at the end. If you have it at the top, it might be that it doesn't make sense to have save, and you might disable it because the user hasn't changed anything. In this case, I think that having it dimmed doesn't provide a very good user experience for a user in accessibility. Now, mobile and web vary quite differently. I'm going to make some generalizations here. It's not always going to be true, but mobile tends to have a lot more pagination than web. You might be quickly going between pages backwards and forwards. And as we saw with Rick, you might have more modal views that pop up in front with errors, alerts, loading indicators. And the focus with these is very important. When we show an error, we need to pull the focus to the error or the alert. And then, when we take focus away from that, we need to think about where the focus was and where it should be. Apple automatically will take it to the closest point behind the element that was focused. So if it was on cancel, it would take it to the cell behind that. Now, for a user, this isn't very helpful. What if you clicked save in the top right-hand corner and it said that your internet connection isn't working? Where am I? I'm now somewhere down at the bottom of the screen. Now I need to explore the whole of the screen. Maybe if save was at the bottom and it takes you back up to the top. So we need to really think about focus control. Where did the user come from and how can we send them back there to keep continuity going through the app? So with a filter button, for example, it might load up a new screen. When we come back, we want to take the focus back to the same place that they started from. And this can be seen when paging as well. I click on a cell, I read the information on that cell, I click back, and Apple automatically takes me back to the first cell in the table view. Now, it might be that there are hundreds of cells in this table view, and I'm reading something and going through all of them. Do we really want to be sending the user back to the very first one automatically? So hopefully, on this brief dive into focus, you can appreciate that there's a lot more than meets the eye. If you thought that focus was purely the screen reader and just getting your elements all lined up in a row, hopefully you can see a little bit differently now. If you want your mobile app to really cater for all of your users, then you need to start thinking about how they use the app and how we can ensure continuity through the app. Next, we're going to look at accessibility labels. And we're coming back to this example again. So the accessibility label for the call us on the left will probably initially, automatically, take the words from the text. Lost or stolen cards within Australia. 0800 number. Hopefully we're putting something around 24 hours a day, 7 days. Is that really the best that we can do? With accessibility labels, we really want to be thinking a little bit deeper. We've thought about the focus. Now, how can we provide context for the user in the label? And this links back to the section heading. Instead of just saying lost or stolen cards, let's include that in. Call us about lost or stolen cards within Australia. Our number, on 1-800. Our offices are open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Immediately, little words that you add in string all the information together. It can be easy to think about, we want to make this as quick as possible. Our accessible users are really in a rush. But those words really help your brain understand it, as that would be how someone would talk to you about it. Now, I'm not saying that we should start putting pleases and thank yous in. I've heard a lot of negative feedback about apps that just add in unnecessary filler words. But really, when putting together accessibility labels, we need to be thinking about the information that comes together as a whole. The view on the right, presumably we'd want to talk to our accessible users and decide which information is the most important that you want to hear first. And then pull together that accessibility label from there. Now, when working on mobile, we have very different tools to those on web. And I don't know very much about web design, so I'm not going to talk about it at all. On mobile, though, we have a lot that we can do with individual elements to make accessibility easier and for us to be able to really nuance it just how we want it to be. The first is the element, is it accessible or not? So this view, this cell, is actually a view, and we have 4 labels in there, but we don't want the focus to go to any of those labels. So we're able to turn is accessible element to off, to false. And then the view itself, we can keep that to be on. So now the focus will and won't go to certain areas. And this is very easy to do. Rick was talking about on web, it's quite hard to do, but for us, we can really set states on views and then set it to be yay or nay for is it an accessible element. The label that we've already talked about, when setting an accessible label, it just comes in right in the same place that the regular code does. So if we're setting the non-accessible text, we can also have a variable which is the accessible text. And we can look at the situation that we're in, maybe the size of the screen. We can look, is screen reader on or off? And we can manually write code to change that accessibility label. Maybe the user has an error. Put the error into the accessibility label that we're reading out. Next is traits. Now this is really, really useful. Here we have a view, but we don't want the user just to hear that it's a view. We can click on this view, but it is not a button, it is still a view. We can give it the trait button, and then Apple will add in a few helpful filler words like button at the end of it, and double tap to press. Other examples might be that you want to create something that looks like a text entry field, or looks like a label. And we can do that, and we can change it to be static text or a text field. And that's really useful in being able to customize what we make, but present to the user what they think that it is. The final aspect is a hint. And we can add a hint, and saying something is a hint means that it's not really key information, but it's pretty useful. And Apple will automatically put that at the end of the accessibility label when it reads it out. So in this example, 15 more letters to go. You have to at least make a comment of 15 characters. Now, that's not vital information. It's going to be rare that a user tries to type only a few characters. And if they do try to send that, it will pop them up an error, and then they'll write more. But it is useful information. And so that's, again, one of the tools that we can add, maybe on a flight booking service. You have to enter your reference number. Giving them the format of the reference number is a useful piece of information if they're then trying to find it on their laptop to put it into their app. So, in conclusion, accessibility labels are really important, and they provide a lot of information to the users. There's more than just adding alternative text, and there's more than just taking what text you've put in there and reading it out to the user. We need to think about how the information fits together and then add further information around this. Finally, we're going to talk about dynamic text, and this is how the text gets bigger and smaller based on the size of your phone and also the text size that you've set on your iPhone. The first step is just turning it on. It's not automatic on iOS and Android. You have to add a little bit of code to do it, but it's not very complicated. What seems to be very complicated is finding a good example of this. I went through every app on my phone and tried to find a really good example to be like, this is how you do it. And the best I could come up with is this horrible example from Mail. Apps just don't do this. It is not difficult to develop, but as we were talking about, as some of the talks were mentioning, and the keynote talks this morning, it really starts with design. And at the moment, no one is starting with design. So turning it on might not be the problem. Sometimes you need to turn it off. So here's one of the apps that I have on my phone. I'm not going to mention them because I don't think it would be appropriate. And they haven't really worried about dynamic text at all. So you can see the text on the left, they haven't got it turned on. But some of the automatic text has picked it up. Sometimes it might just turn little bits of it on automatically. And so now we can see that A, the lovely design that they did is not quite as they wanted it, but also that it's very difficult for you to read the information that you have out there. Another really interesting example is Facebook. We can see on the left default text, and then on the right I turned it up to max, extra, extra, extra large, and the text has got a little bit bigger. And so obviously the app knows about text sizes. They must have done something to make it get a little bit bigger, but then they've capped it, maybe just at large, or not even large. So a lot of the time apps are maybe aware of it, but they don't want to add it in. And this is a real paradigm shift for both developers and designers. When you're developing, you have to get rid of any hard-coded values. In the old days on iPhone, a cell was 44 pixels high, and you'll just put that in and then design everything around that. Now, every view that you design has to be able to just come out the bottom. Maybe you've got to put it in a scroll view. For designers, you have to start thinking about the way you design. How will this now affect the screen? What will happen on the extremes? The largest text size and the smallest phone. You can't code an entire screen, just one screen anymore. You have to code for all the screens. And this really pulls us to our design considerations. Here is the weather app, and this is a good example of why Melbourne is better than Sydney. And you can see the design considerations they've thought here. We're going to make it with dynamic text, but we do still want to keep the snazzy view that we've got. Now, I would argue that they should have probably loosened how they wanted it to look to improve the readability of the view. Now, MUN abbreviating to Monday, it's not the hardest thing. You can pretty much work it out. But squishing up, having a smaller icon, squishing it all up, it feels a little bit like it was very much an afterthought of how can we keep all the designs that we've got, rather than thinking, how is this going to be the best for user understandability? And this is really an issue for designers when you've got your app. Here's the AFL app, and it works great, in my opinion, a fantastic app, but if they wanted to make this accessible, there's going to be a lot of changes. All the labels next to each other are really going to start fighting with each other. The buttons at the bottom, maybe you're going to start pushing each other off the screen. And so there's going to have to be a lot of changes that they make. And this is one of the most difficult things for developers and also for designers, is accepting that it's okay if your app looks bad. A bad app, or a bad-looking app that can be used by everyone is much more important than having something that looks great but can only be used by the majority. And so, in my opinion, with dynamic text, you really need to start going back to the drawing board. We need to start thinking about accessibility from the very beginning. It's not hard to make a design that is accessible, but it is very hard to change a design to be accessible. Now, in the awareness of time, I only have a little bit left. I'm going to zoom through these. I've been bagging Apple a little bit about how they don't help us at all. But there are a lot of things that they do to make it easier for us as developers. And they provide a wonderful tool, which is downloadable with Xcode, the programming software, called Accessibility Inspector. And this makes it really easy for us to test against accessibility. So we can load it up, load it with a simulator on our computer, and then, as you can see here, test the label, the traits of individual elements. And we can go through the entire app testing against that. We can also test against the size of the text. So we can put it on lots of different phones, make it bigger or smaller. And we can also run miniature audits on our code. They don't pick up high-level things, but they're pretty good at picking up lower-level aspects. So hopefully, some of the key takeaways you've got from this talk is that the best way to develop for accessibility, for mobile and for web, is to do it at every step of the process. If you have a single link in your chain from designers, BAs, developers, testers, then the accessibility will really suffer for it. Thank you very much for listening. My name is Smiley-Andrews. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn if you have any questions. I think I am 4 seconds over, so I don't know if we'll have time for questions.
You are probably about 4 seconds over, but that's okay because the next changeover is lunch. So anybody who wants lunch will be at 12:30 outside in just out the front of the plenary room. If Simon's okay to take one or two questions, then
can take as
I'm
many as you want.
okay to have people ask. And we've got one in the middle. Yeah.
Coming, Hamish. Make me run halfway across the room. There you go.
Hi, Simon. We on? Yep. As a fellow financial industry worker, I would firstly love for you to come and tell me if you ever convince a product owner that something doesn't have to look good as long as it works for everyone. If you crack that one, I would love to know how you did it. And secondly, regarding your point around hints, again, I think you made some really valid points there. The thing with hints, a lot of people have them turned off. So if you're putting something that's essential into your app, you might think about maybe putting it in a label.
Yeah.
But because a lot of people work with hints off until they can't figure something out, and then they might turn them on. And the other thing is that you talked about was your you have to use your 15 characters. Anyone, please, if you're doing an edit field that has a countdown, please don't set that thing to be live, so that every time I type a letter, I hear 256, 254, 253, 252, and I can't actually hear what I'm typing. So that's another one that I've seen quite frequently, but just wanted to point out the hints. And
No, I completely agree about hints. In general, I don't think we're currently working on the new Public Transport Victoria app, which is very, very accessibility focused. And I don't think I've used a hint in the last couple of years working on mobile accessibility. In my opinion, there should be no reason why you need to do it. If you need to start giving hints, then you need to change your design. And that's something that designers don't like hearing very much. When I talk to designers and I go, actually, we're having all these troubles because of the design, and they kind of often say, well, this is the design. It's your job to figure out how to write the accessibility for it. But no, I agree. Hints, in my opinion, they don't even have hints on Android, so that's as much as they're vital in mobile.
Cool. All right. Thank you very much, Simon.